this webinar on the recently announced request for information on advancing equity and support for underserved communities through government. I am Keenan Reed, a co-founder of the Black Women's Congressional Alliance, which empowers, promotes, trains, and retains Black women congressional staffers. On behalf of BWCA and co-host POPVOX Foundation and Representative Democracy, I want to welcome everyone who's joined us today. I'd also like to extend a very special thank you to the Democracy Fund and the Hewlett Foundation for support of this work. You may wonder why people who mainly focus on Congress, like BWCA, are hosting a discussion about a process that is taking place in the executive branch. Many people don't realize that congressional offices are on the front lines when government services are not easily accessible or when information is not clear. For many, the final result when things don't work is to call their member of Congress. We who have worked on Capitol Hill have taken those calls and have seen real life impact of systemic barriers to access, inclusion, and opportunity. In the next hour, we will hear about the important process that is getting started within federal agencies to take a look at their own practices and to consider a new way of doing things. Our moderators today are Noralisa who manages Representative Democracy, a group of nonpartisan organizations, civil rights groups, and leadership practitioners working to cultivate an ecosystem of diverse leadership talent and career development opportunities in public service. Raised in a family of public servants and elected officials along the Texas-Mexico border, she is a strong believer in the power of civic engagement and political participation. Marci Harris is the co-founder of POPVOX.com and the POPVOX Foundation, which works to support innovation in government and civic engagement. Marci is a former congressional staffer and a lawyer with a background in administrative law.
So much, Keenan, and I will actually also attempt to share my screen. So my job is to give you a little bit of background on what we're discussing. Some will be very familiar to many of you, and for also some of you, it will be completely new. So just to give a bit of background, on Inauguration Day, President Biden signed an executive order directing all federal agencies to pursue a comprehensive approach to advancing equity for all, including people of color and others who've been historically underserved, marginalized, and adversely affected by persistent poverty and inequality. And then on May 5th, the Office of Management and Budget, which is the main administrative agency responsible for the entire federal government, issued a request for information, an RFI, which you'll hear us talking about a lot, asking the public to provide input on methods and leading practices for advancing equity and support for underserved communities through government. This is the opening stage of what will be a very long process to change the way the US government operates. What we know comes next, and we don't know everything that comes next, is that public comments are due at midnight on July 6th, 2021. Federal agencies are right now working on their own assessments of the state of equity for underserved communities and individuals within their own agencies, and those must be submitted to the Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy by August 8th. And then these agencies must develop a plan for addressing any barriers to full and equal participation in programs and procurement opportunities identified in its assessment, and those plans are due on January 19, 2022. And that's just stage one. In 2022, agencies will take input on their proposed plans and release final plans. There may be requests to Congress to allocate funding for recommendations in those plans or for permission to change existing procedures. So if this is such a long process, why is it important to join the conversation now? And that's because this is the opportunity to influence what examples or research or perspectives are considered in this process. Agencies can consider, in fact, they must consider information that is submitted by the public, and this is the opportunity to help shape the record that they'll be looking at.
So I'm going to underscore a couple of things that Marci pointed out. But first of all, as stakeholders, I think it's important to recognize that we have that enviable position to be at the table as every single agency in the US government thinks about these issues and how to better build equity throughout the agency. Some of you may recall that past efforts in the government have looked at diversity in hiring and recruitment, but this focus on equity seeks to create a deeper change, a cultural change across agencies from programs to grants, to vendor relationships, to outreach and engagement. What further stands out in this RFI is the multifaceted and deep dive approach that OMB is taking and the various touch points that exist for public input and comment. Personally, as myself, as a longtime advocate for inclusion, it is notable that they are reaching out to our communities early in the process to inform that first agency deliverable that Marci was talking about in August. That is a remarkable opportunity for all of us to be thought partners and contributors in this effort. I'm going to put in a plug here that this session is being recorded, and if you know of other organizations as we walk through this, particularly at that local level, that would benefit from this discussion, please share this with your networks. So now that we've talked a little bit about the process, I'm going to dig into the content of what OMB is looking for. The RFI identifies 5 key areas of inquiry with suggested questions to guide your response. Before jumping in, here are some general observations from reviewing these questions. The areas apply to every agency and policy focus, but it is worth noting that there is a particular request for equity assessment tools to be used in, quote, agencies with national security, foreign policy, or law enforcement missions. I'm flagging that note for any of you who work in that space, or if you know of other groups that may want to participate in this process, as they do go out of their way to single it out. Overall, the RFI seeks guidance in developing tools, methods, and research that will assess equity or quantify or illustrate the impact of inequity. They recognize that organizations like yours, particularly at that community level, may already be doing this work and are looking for best practices or case studies. Individual stories and anecdotes of this work would be very, very powerful and very authentic. I should also note, to one of the points Marci raised, that reviewers are very comfortable with any academic research or data you have related to the questions. Another thing that comes out as you look through the questions, they are cognizant of in identifying those kinds of changes that can be made today or in the short term and what can be done over time. And you will notice that as you walk through the questions. So let's dive in. For the sake of brevity, I'm just going to, again, big picture and not go through every single question. Area number 1, equity assessments and strategies. This is where government must assess what future practices and policies to ensure they advance equity and that equity is embedded in how they operate. That means creating or having a framework to assess equity, its impact in quantitative form on underserved communities, and the ability to identify systemic inequities to be addressed by changes in agency policy. So some of the questions to consider, and they're pretty lengthy, so we won't go through all of them, but again, big picture, what should those tools, methods, and approaches for equity assessment look like? How would they operate day to day? Should staff be trained, or what skill sets do they need to effectively use these equity assessment tools? For those of you who work at the local, tribal, or territorial level, they are very interested to hear from you on best practices that basically function as equity assessment tools and are applicable to the federal government. Again, for those of you working with targeted communities, you may not have thought anything about how you're doing things and getting results, but somewhere along the process, that knowledge, that information is exactly what the government is trying to incorporate at the federal level. Area number 2, barrier and burden reduction. This approaches and methods for assessing and remedying barriers, burden, and inequities in public service delivery and access. This includes external factors that disproportionately affect access to programs and information, and the internal barriers in the administration of programs. Area 2 may be of particular interest to social service delivery groups or any entity or individual who has worked with communities who have experienced the joy of navigating through the maze of government eligibility rules and program guidelines and the unfortunate result of program drop-off or churn. Questions here seek to quantify the disproportionate impact this may have on underserved communities, including looking for strategies that address issues of distrust and privacy in data collection requirements. Area number 3, procurement and contracting. These are approaches and methods for assessing equity in agency procurement and contracting. Specifically, they're looking for guidance on how to assess opportunities that will direct more procurement and contracting dollars to underserved individuals and communities. Some of the questions here, and again, this is a little bit more on the quantitative side. How they include a deeper look into current procurement systems and barriers to entry. Again, the construction of an equity assessment model of the whole vendor acquisition lifecycle, from outreach all the way through to the evaluation of contractor performance, and how to identify inequity in the award of subcontracts. Ideas and outreach strategies to business owners and entrepreneurs, and questions such as what data collection should be collected and used to assess equity in procurement practices. Area number 4 covers financial assistance. This discussion includes grant opportunities and other activities that provide direct dollars into underserved communities and individuals. The questions here, questions to consider include approaches, data collection, and methods for assessing equity in the grant-making process and how those dollars are delivered, outreach and stakeholder engagement strategies to make grants more accessible, and the skill sets and training that is needed in-house to administer equity-based grant making in the federal government. The last area, area number 5, covers stakeholder and community engagement. It instructs agencies to expand their use of stakeholder and community engagement in carrying out the executive order. OMB's questions in this section are actually likely to mirror the outreach and strategic communication strategy many of you use in your own advocacy campaigns to reach targeted communities. Elements, and these may sound familiar to some of you, may include the need for distinct, targeted, and relevant messaging, the use of trusted messengers, native languages, accessible channels for feedback and further questions. That world is clarity and more detail is what the government is looking for in this section. But just to highlight some of the questions to consider: processes needed to engage with underserved individuals and communities, including early outreach to shape agency policy priorities and strategies. Tools and best practices to establish advisory board, task forces, and commissions that are inclusive of underserved communities, and identifying the barriers that limit community interactions with federal agencies and programs. Let me first put out my disclaimer that I'm not a lawyer, and this summary is a very high-level read of each section. I invite you to read through this supplemental information. It is on page 3 of the Federal Register or in the link that was shared with you earlier at the very bottom of the page. And dig down into each suggested question as you think about your organization's response. Our panelists, including lawyers, will be going into more details, sharing insights and tips that may help you in your approach. So to that point, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first panelist, a true believer in inclusive leadership in government, who with every conversation we have continues to teach me something new about public service, equity, inclusion, and how to get there. From her earliest days working with Denver's first Latino mayor, Federico Peña, to advising cabinet secretaries, to leading the U.S. Office of Personnel Management under President Barack Obama, it's OPM, Katherine Archuleta's career has been focused on bringing voices to the table that have been historically and intentionally pushed away. As OPM director, she directed the federal government's diversity and inclusion strategic plan in collaboration with the White House and all federal departments. Katherine, among other things, Katherine currently serves on the Representative Democracy Brain Trust, a group of practitioners and experts who work across communities to support and encourage learning, methods, and tactics that advance DEI in public service and build inclusive workplaces. So Without further ado, Ms. Katherine Archuleta.
And so thank you to everybody who put this panel together. BWCA and co-host POPVOX Foundation and Representative Democracy. I'm honored to be a part of this webinar, and Noralisa, thank you very much for your kind introduction. You know, when Noralisa asked me to join the webinar, it immediately sparked memories of my role as director of OPM, and that agency responsible for human resources management for 2 million federal workers. It also inspired me to remember my role as chief of staff at DOL and the process of rulemaking and the close relationships that we had with worker rights advocates, labor unions, policy experts, and community leaders during those processes. So of course, I immediately agreed. So when I reviewed the RFI, I identified 5 reasons why I believe it is significant. The first reason is very clear. On Inauguration Day, President Biden signed an executive order directing all federal agencies to pursue a comprehensive approach to advancing equity for all, including people of color and others who have been historically underserved, marginalized, and adversely affected by persistent poverty and inequality. Now, all of those words are very important, but let me pick out a few that certainly caught my eye. All federal agencies are directed to develop comprehensive approaches. Not just one agency will be held accountable, but all federal agencies will be held accountable to plans and timelines. His executive order requires departments and agencies to assess the state of equity for underserved communities and individuals served by their departments and report to the DPC August 8th, 2021. They must present accurate and transparent data about their agencies. And then 5 months later, they must deliver their plans that will address the barriers to full and equal participation in programs and procurement opportunities. In 1 year, all federal departments and agencies are required to come up with their plans for advancing equity for all. Employees and the people they serve, employees and the programs they direct, employees and their budgets they manage, and employees and department leaders examining their own internal practices that may be perpetuating discrimination or bias. This is very significant. As former director of OPM, I understand how important it is that federal agencies be required to and be held accountable for the removal of the practices, policies, and programs that perpetuate discrimination, bias, inequities, both internally and externally. The second reason this is significant is that OMB is seeking this RFI. For those of you who know federal government well, you understand the significance of OMB in this RFI role. You know that OMB is a point of balance between policy programs and funding. It is the main administrative agency responsible for the whole entire federal government. Their leadership in this effort speaks volumes to every federal agency about how important this is to the president. I remember very vividly the President's Management Council, led by OMB, where directors were held accountable to the directives of the president. My third reason for significance of this RFI is based on my role as Chief of Staff at the Department of Labor. You heard earlier that OMB must, not can, but must consider public comment as it writes its policies. It must base its conclusion just not on their own views or expertise. It must solicit and consider the views of the public. Well, we are the public. I would imagine that each of us in this webinar today have spoken out many times about why we believe the federal government has not used its resources to advance equity for all. We have conferenced, shouted, written, blogged, texts about how so many of our communities have been historically underserved. We have stated over and over again how federal government policies and practices have failed to meet the needs of the most vulnerable and have perpetuated institutional racism explicitly and implicitly. This RFI asks us to raise our voices, to tell our stories of how practice personnel and funding may have prolonged the marginalization of people of color and other communities. Finally, after 4 years, we are being asked again to tell our stories, to present the facts, and to describe what the lived experience is beyond the Beltway. Those of us in the BIPOC community and our allies are being asked to share those lived experiences of those affected by policies, practices, and programs, or lack thereof, of the federal government. We cannot hesitate to do so. And this leads me to the fourth reason, and this is really important to remember. I am sure we all here are painfully familiar with what the previous administration did to prevent equity within federal policies and programs. As a former director of OPM, I was appalled to learn that that administration eliminated the requirement for diversity training for federal workers. Those workers whose daily work lives impacted the very communities we care so much about. Those workers whose attitudes, experiences, understandings, and yes, maybe even implicit and explicit biases, who determine the quality of engagement with community and the delivery of programs. They wiped away the opportunities those employees had to become even better federal employees. What is even more disturbing to me is the number of external organizations, associations, and powerful individuals who actively and forcefully supported the previous administration's exclusionary practices. Please do not for one moment think that those who supported those policies are not preparing their comments right now. Don't for one moment believe that they will support policies or programs that address the needs of those adversely affected by persistent poverty and inequality. They do not believe that the federal government has a role to play, and they will be very forceful in their comments. We should not and cannot allow their comments to dominate. And finally, voices matter. This past year has been devastating for families, children, communities across our country. In the next 3.5 years, the Biden administration will focus important attention through all of its departments and agencies on those who have been underserved. Practices, policies, rules, and regulations are the tools they will use to make the changes we seek. But to do so, they need our voices to inform them, to advise them, and to support them as they work to create the change they seek to make. You do not need to be the expert, but you do need to do your homework so that your comments can help OMB and the Domestic Policy Council design their policies for change. It can appear complicated. You may even think it's too hard to do, but remember, please remember that you are only 1 degree, maybe 2 degrees away from someone or some organization who can show you how to make it easier. This is where our networks matter. This is where forums like this make a difference. Get help so that your comments can be the most effective they can possibly be. I'm sure our colleagues at BWCA, POPVOX, and Representative Democracy can help in finding those coaches. Many voices matter, and our collective voices matter. I hope that you can recruit comments from a diverse group of organizations and individuals so that OMB and the DPC have significant support for the policies they write. Your voices will become part of the record and collectively form the basis for not only the policy, but also the administration's budget requests to Congress. We have not been afraid of difficult before, so don't let it stand in your way now. When I was at DOL during the Obama administration, we relied on organizations, institutions, and individuals to give us the support we needed to write the rules that were intended to protect workers and worker rights. We work closely with OMB to assure that the rules that we drafted were based not only on our own expertise, but also what communities, institutions, associations, and individuals identified and expected. We relied on public comment to make sure we got it right. OMB is asking all of us to help them get it right, to lay the solid foundation for diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging in all aspects of the federal government. And in this moment of our history, for me, whatever I can do to help to solidify equity as an integral part of all of President Biden's domestic policy, well, that's an assignment I believe is very much worth signing up for.
Thank you so much, Director Archuleta, for your encouraging comments. Thank you so much. And now it's my pleasure to introduce a former official in the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs during the Bush administration and a current assistant professor of politics at the University of Virginia. Rachel Augustine Potter is the author of Bending the Rules, Procedural Politicking in the Bureaucracy, which explores the notice and comment rulemaking process within federal agencies. Rachel, you're up.
Thanks for that introduction. And thanks for having me. This is a really historic opportunity. So I'm glad there's so many people interested in participating. So I want to give my perspective both as a former official at the Office of Management and Budget, and also as an academic who's worked a lot with notice and comment rulemaking, which is very similar to what's happening with this RFI. So I want to give a little bit of perspective about exactly kind of how OMB might be approaching this right now. So this executive order that directed the Office of Management and Budget to do this activity came out, as Director Archuleta said, on Biden's first day in office, January 20th, he signed that executive order. Until 12 at noon on the 20th, OMB officials were working to implement President Trump's agenda. At 12:01, they switch over to Biden's agenda. So this is a new process to them. They've just taken up this policy in January, and it's been probably pretty breakneck to get to this point, right? To get to the point where we all are reading and having a webinar about an RFI. So, so this is new for them, for all of us too, to think about what we want to do here. And I want to think about the team at OMB that's going to read your comments, right? These are going to be career staff, so people that have been probably working at the agency for multiple administrations. Most of their job, I would say, 97% is not dealing with the public, it's dealing with other agencies and Congress and all kinds of things within the executive branch. They are still doing all of that work while they are going to have to deal with this RFI. And I mention that because it's going to be really important to get your comment to be very readable to someone who is very busy. So you might think about how you would normally do that for anybody you work with who's busy, right? Start thinking about headings and headers and bullet points and that kind of thing. So most staff at OMB are, they're technocrats in the sense that most have an advanced graduate degree, mostly in public policy, but also economics and other fields. So these are people who are going to be familiar with an academic study. If you put it in, it's not going to freak them out. But at the same time, they're generalists. They deal with a lot of policy areas. So they're not necessarily going to know the jargon from your field. So you're going to have to help them with that a little bit. Remember, you're writing to someone who doesn't know a lot about specific things that might be really, really integral to your work processes. So you're writing for a generalist who's a fairly educated person in general. Okay, so that said, you kind of have a sense of maybe who's reading this, but let's think also about what kind of input you want to give. And here I'm going to switch from like my OMB hat and put my professor hat on and say, okay, when I give students an assignment and there's a question, the first thing is answer the questions that were asked. You've been given in this RFI very specific questions and a very specific mandate. And that mandate is tell us about the methods we should use to approach equity going forward, right? This is a process-based process. They're asking you about tools. So like when I scanned the RFI, I saw lots of mention of tools, methods, data, right? They want to know, what are your processes, or what do you know from academic literature or best practices in your field about how to do this methodologically speaking. So you have lots of ideas about historic inequities and all kinds of things that have gone wrong, I'm sure. This isn't going to help you right now. Right now, you need to talk about the methods that we can start applying in the federal government, and what they look like. What has your experience been with that, right? And so I want to highlight one sentence for you from the RFI, which says, OMB will consider the usability, applicability, and rigor of submissions in response to the RFI. Okay, so you're looking at how usable are the recommendations for agencies? How applicable are they going to, how easy is it going to be to apply? And how rigorous is this? Is this, right, this is an administration that cares about evidence-based policymaking. That does not need, I'm not saying academic research, it's great if you have it, but it doesn't mean that necessarily. It means support your argument or your recommendation or your proposal with examples, and whatever evidence you can bring to bear. Okay, so if you are able to provide academic research, all the better. Make sure to provide a full citation so they can go read it. And this is also, I think, a really important point is, don't just say, here's a study. Here is a study we are aware of, or a report that our organization did that says X, and this is why it matters for you, OMB, and how we think you should apply it to what you're doing. So take that extra step and help them apply it to the problem so they can see how you see that study applying to this problem or report or whatever it is. A couple more comments and then I'll turn it over to my co-panelist. One thing I want to note is you can go read all of the other comments that other organizations are putting. They're on regulations.gov. We can probably, I think, put a link up for you and go do that. See what other people are recommending. Are you in agreement with them? Great. You might want to note that somebody else agrees with you. Do you disagree? That's also useful information. Say why you think that their proposed approach is not right. Let them know, weigh in now, don't wait till later. Okay, so and then two additional final points is that you don't need to go it alone. A lot of research shows that when organizations partner with others, they make coalitions to comment, that they find that they have a much louder voice, much more weight to what they're saying. So maybe you can find other organizations that are in agreement with you. That's a really powerful thing to do. So I would highly encourage you to seek that out. And then finally, maybe I've worried you a little bit to say research and evidence, and this does not need to be a lawyerly written thing. This needs to be professional. It needs to be concise. It needs to be clear, and it needs to be specific. It does not need to be a legal document. It needs to be something that another policy professional could pick up and say, okay, I get what they want here and why. So I think you've got these resources in-house, and don't be afraid. This is open to everyone on purpose because the government is looking for your feedback here. So I'll stop there, but thanks.
Thanks so much, Rachel, for all the pro tips. And now I would like to introduce lawyer turned anthropologist, Chandra L. Middleton. Chandra is a Ph.D. candidate in anthropology at the University of California, Irvine, who studied the rulemaking process at EPA, including how federal agencies process and consider public comments. Chandra, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. And thanks to POPVOX Foundation and Representative Democracy for holding this really, really useful webinar. I want to take a step back from this specific RFI to place it in a broader context of policy development, because there have been some terms that have been thrown around and they can get really, really confusing for folks who aren't used to the executive branch's way of doing things. And this context is important because the government is likely to solicit public comment at many points along the way. From learning about an issue, such as with this particular RFI, to learning how a specific regulation might affect the public. So while at base, the government invites public comment as a way to collect data, not all public comments move through the government in the same ways. And knowing which type of public comment you're working on can help shape the comments that you submit. I'm going to discuss two types of public comment. Perhaps not surprisingly, the first one is going to be the RFI that we're all here to talk about. So RFIs are probably the clearest example of data gathering. Here, OMB wants to learn what people know about, in this case, advancing equity and support for underserved communities. So other panelists have touched on this. What are best practices? What does the research say? What is your experience with dealing with advancing equity and support for underserved communities? What sort of methods have you used? All of that. As Marci mentioned earlier, this particular RFI is part of a long process. So getting in on the ground floor with your comments will help orient OMB to the aspects of diversity and inclusion that they need to be aware of. This orientation, in turn, will help OMB to shape how it moves forward with other agencies. I think sometimes the government is assumed to know everything, but simply fails to act on it. And here, the government knows that it has some knowledge gaps and is asking us, you, to share your ideas, your experience, all of which adds up to your expertise. Again, whether it's in lawyer format or in academic format, it doesn't have to be. It's still expertise, and the government can still benefit from it. So this is truly a case where if you don't share that expertise, they might not know about it from anyone else. So the second type of public comment I want to discuss is the kind that happens in the context of something called notice and comment rulemaking, which Rachel briefly mentioned. It's also known as informal rulemaking, just to confuse matters. And if you ask many agency employees who are often engaged in kind of making policy broadly, they might say that all they do is rulemaking, which is true. But here, with notice and comment rulemaking, I'm referencing a specific legal process as identified in the Administrative Procedure Act that results in a legally binding regulation. It's a specific process in which public comments have a slightly different valence than comments submitted under an RFI. The government's still seeking information from the public, but in this case, it's legally required to do so through a different path than the RFI. The agency is legally required to consider comments it has received and to respond to those comments in some way. And that is often, those response to comments are often found either in the final rule or in separate documents incorporated by reference into the final rule, all of which can be found on the regulations.gov docket for any particular rulemaking. So comments submitted in the process of notice and comment rulemaking become part of the administrative record, like the RFI comments. And in that case, they might also play a role in subsequent legal processes. So it's data collection, but data collection for a specific legal purpose and with potential legal features. Okay, so the distinction between a request for comment through an RFI and one as a result of notice and comment rulemaking is important. But first, how can you tell which is which? So on the first page of the RFI, which I believe you have a link to, and that page is found in the Federal Register, volume 86, number 85, page 24,029. There's an entry that identifies the action as a request for information. If this were a notice and comment rulemaking situation, the action would read proposed rule or advance notice of proposed rule. And so that orients you to kind of where they are in the policymaking process. And so that becomes meaningful to you because rulemaking tends to occur at the end of a policymaking process when the ideas are already set to some degree. There's a general direction of which policy is going in, and that's already been set, even if the details are still being hammered out. Requests for information, as with this one, are generally issued at the start of a policymaking process, while the administration is still trying to figure out which direction to head, or in this case, simply needs more information to make good policy. So comments that you submit before midnight on July 6th might not play the same role in subsequent litigation, but they can direct the policy goals, regulatory processes, and perspectives that are considered in subsequent rulemakings and certainly in agency procedure. In short, if you submit a comment to an RFI like this one, you are really helping to shape the way that the government thinks about this issue. And one final note, for those of you who might not have had much interaction with career civil servants, those who will be reading your comments, I spent months at the EPA and months conducting interviews with people who have retired from the EPA and other agencies. And I found overwhelmingly that they are intellectually curious about things that they work with, things that they want to work with. And even when they can't act on that intellectual curiosity because of legal and bureaucratic structures, they're still curious. And so I guess I just hope that you'll take advantage of their intellectual curiosity and of this amazing opportunity to share your expertise with them. There's so much at stake, and your voice, your experience matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Chandra. And now that we've heard from those who have been on the receiving end of public comments, I'm happy to welcome Dr. Stephanie Rodriguez to share her perspective on what it's like to prepare a submission to a federal agency. Stephanie is the Federal Partnership Director at Tech Talent Project. An immunologist by training, Stephanie served as a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the National Science Foundation, the STEM Policy Director for the After School Alliance, and most recently, as Vice President of Policy and Engagement at AnitaB.org, a global nonprofit advancing women technologists into positions of power. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you, Keenan, and thanks for the invitation to be on this panel. It's really awesome to sort of come after a bunch of experts who've received all of these sorts of submissions from the public and sort of get an opportunity to reiterate a lot of the tips that have been sprinkled in across their conversation points as well. I think I want to just start off by saying the first thing in my experience that community leaders should understand before they get ready to submit their feedback is that you are the expert of your community. You are the subject matter expert of the people you serve, of the issues you advocate for. And so as several panelists shared throughout this, this is a request to get your knowledge, and it's really an opportunity to inform how our policymakers are going to take our expertise into consideration. So I think like first things first, you kind of got to like get your mindset out of that imposter syndrome you might be feeling and really recognize that you know your stakeholders the best, and you have a really great opportunity to elevate the priorities of your community based on your experience serving them and being a member of those communities. So the first thing I like to think about when I'm getting ready to submit a request for information like this is really to think about my mission. And then identify the places of alignment based on what the request is asking for. And so, Rachel, I think you were super clear, right? Like answer the questions that are being asked in the proposal, absolutely. And think about how, when you answer those questions, you can get your main points across about the mission you have as an individual or on behalf of your organization. So I worked in a lot of different community spaces. And so sometimes that mission is women's workforce advancement. In my current role, it's making sure the government can have opportunities to hire diverse technologists. Either way, there's an opportunity for you to get your points across in these RFIs. The second thing I would say is that you really just want to think about how you're going to make your case and how you want to give your advice. So it's really important when you're submitting these pieces of information that you're using both research and citations, but also stories. So the folks who are going to be reading these, as you've heard, are educated folks who have a high level of intellectual curiosity. They are also people who want to understand how the policies they're making are going to directly impact the humans that those policies are meant to serve. So I am of the opinion that the more you can humanize your models and explain the impacts on the people these methodologies and these practices are designed to support, the more persuasive the information you're providing will be. And then a third tip that I have found is very helpful is to offer additional support when you submit this information. So people on the receiving end, I'd be curious if anybody has pushback who's on the receiving end, but they may need to follow up. They may be looking for experts who can go dive deeper, can share more information. And so making sure that you let them know that you are open to follow up, that you would love the chance to support them in thinking through these strategies more deeply is a great opportunity to really establish yourself, your organization, the coalition you represent as a subject matter expert who can be trusted and relied upon to provide great information. And so I think those are sort of high level strategies. And the first time I did this process, I really didn't know where to start. You have you're staring at a blank piece of paper, where do you begin? And I think that that, you know, Katherine mentioned, like, you're not alone, right? There are other folks in the ecosystems you operate in who have written summaries and things like that. So I would say that you can always find a place to start that you can then riff off of to inspire how you want to get started. So would encourage you to think about the different kinds of coalitions, community groups who also operate in the spaces that you are looking to comment on for inspiration on how to get started. And of course, checking out other people's submissions is a good place to start as well. But I would encourage you not to be afraid to take something and modify it and really make it your own if you're a little nervous. But I will also say that POPVOX, I love your inline submission portal. So shameless plug, if more groups could do that, I think it makes it really easy, especially for individuals, to say this is the line in the RFI that I know a lot about. I'm going to highlight it. I'm going to type in all my information there. And then, Marci and the great team at POPVOX are going to help get that information rolled out for you. So lots of ways to sort of cut down on the activation barrier to getting these things started. And then I think in terms of what to include, we talked a lot about really making sure that you're addressing the questions in the request, and including a mix of research, data, and citations to sort of show that these aren't just good feelings that you have, but they're grounded in evidence, that they're rooted in best practices. Those are the sort of pieces of expertise that you're going to want to weave into your conversation. And then again, those personal stories and anecdotes are really powerful to add the full context for why it matters. And I recently learned that another great thing to think about in terms of formatting and making it easy for policymakers to use your information is that you can also include attachments that include slide decks and presentations. So I think I've submitted a lot of PDFs and I've never submitted a slide deck, but just imagine the utility of providing 10 quick slides that succinctly represent your data and your information can make it very easy for policymakers to then take that deck and repurpose it and have all of that stuff in their back pocket. So would encourage you to just really think about, if I were a policymaker, what would I want to get to make my job as easy as possible, because I agree with this person and I want to get their models activated. So just make it easy for them to use. And then ultimately, I think the outcome of that is that you're on the record, your priorities are on the record, you're well on your way to potentially becoming a trusted subject matter expert that can then be called upon to provide additional feedback. And you've made it easy for policymakers to take your knowledge and your expertise and enact it for the good of our country.
Thank you, Stephanie. Okay, so now we'll go to questions. I'm going to turn it over to Marci and Noralisa to lead us.
If other organizations are interested or support the comments we draft, is it best to have them sign on to our submission or to submit a separate set of comments?
This is a really good question. And I would say that if you're signing on to the exact same comment, then maybe rethink that, right? So one of the things that is really important is to connect your experience and your expertise with what you're trying to say. And so it might be as simple as using a different example that another organization has used. Having said that, time is sometimes limited. And so there's certainly no harm in signing on to another organization's comment. There's a question sometimes about whether, right, so that question about whether you submit a second comment or sign on to the same comment. At some point, it's generally better to just sign on to the same comment, but that's usually around 20 organizations or so. And this just comes from my poking around in the regulations.gov archive. And from kind of seeing how those end up being processed. But I would say do your best to make the examples your own and really try to add a depth of experience to the comment, even if you're making the same points.
I'd like to add in there too that it's really important to be both unique in your comments and really showing sort of those examples of lived experience. But it's also really important for you to, if you find comments that you can sign up to do that as well. So don't think it's an either or, it's a both and really making sure that the individuals reading it understand that you have a uniqueness, but it's a shared experience across the country. So they're both really important.
I lead a research project on building tech and data capacity in Congress. I realize that this relationship is sensitive, but there is tremendous value in sharing information gathering processes, including authentic feedback with members in their communities. So collecting it from constituents. Is this kind of sharing method appropriate for this RFI?
And I can chime in a little bit. If the question was a little bit about whether members of Congress can submit and whether they can work with a constituent to submit, the answer is yes, they do. And there's nothing inappropriate about that. If you have your member and you're working with them, sometimes people will write letters to their members and their members will forward them. So that's probably not what you want to do here, but we see that in the docket. I think it's absolutely fine to work that way too. There's nothing wrong with that.
There was a question earlier, but I think you've answered it, Rachel and Chandra, about not being a lawyer. And what about personal stories? How are those used in the process?
I would say personal stories are great to the extent that they answer the question that was asked, right? That is what you want to keep in mind. You've been asked a question. It's about methods, tools, data. How can we approach equity using a sort of systematic approach going forward to systematically deal with historic inequities? Can your personal experience or the anecdote of your organization speak to that? Absolutely include it. Is it sort of like tangential? Probably not. Again, busy people who are going to read thousands of these things. Don't waste your space and their time by doing that, I would say.
I would just add, if I could for a second, I think that kind of knowledge moves differently throughout the government. And so, when the agency OMB is kind of collecting information, you can present your anecdotes in a way that not only links up with the question, but that also kind of forwards your argument, right? And so if you make that connection, that's really kind of the key to making the anecdote or to making your experience, more appropriately said, really relevant to what it is. And so as Professor Rachel mentioned, it's all about answering the question, right? And so if every single sentence that you write is in response in some way to answering that question, that's a good way to check yourself, right? Like, does this somehow forward what I'm trying to say in an answer to that question? That's one way to, check yourself.
Perfect. Last question to Stephanie. Do you have any tips on dealing with coordinating and organizing coalitions that are signing onto letters together?
Sure. So I think it depends on what your role is in the coalition. A good place to start is just to understand how the leadership of the coalition might draft and then share out a template of a response based on the priorities of the coalition. And then a good next step is for members of that coalition to take that draft, that template, and modify it so it is unique, but of the same issue areas like has been discussed on this panel. So you might have letters that maybe have some similar text at the top, but then really go into the unique priorities for why a member of that coalition is even a part of the coalition, right? So I think it's sort of you utilize the coalition energy as a starting place, and then you make your specific response unique within that larger context. Of course, I think as Chandra and Rachel suggested, that you have a large coalition that is all on board with your message, it can also be very powerful to have a submission with 150 organizations or individuals signing on to that statement as well. And so again, not like either or, but like yes and. I think it's the strategy there.
Perfect. Over to you, Keenan.
Fantastic. Well, I don't have a formal question for you, but I can say the survey results from my text messages and looking in the chat is that this was such a helpful discussion. I'm getting all sorts of texts about how demystifying the process is just such an important piece of participation. So with that, I just say thank you to all of our panelists today. For everybody who's watching, the video will be available. You'll also receive a survey, and please let us know if you have any questions. And if there's an interest in additional webinars, if you want more information, we can always follow up. And that's it. Nice to be with you all today.